All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome today. Thank you so much for joining us for our third Roadshow. Hopefully, we are getting them right at this point, but excited to be going to a new region of the country for this discussion today. So I'm going to give a very brief overview on the NSF Engines program, then you're going to hear from some fantastic ecosystem builders, and then you're going to have an opportunity to meet innovators across the country and within your region and talk about opportunities to work together on this exciting program. So let's get started here in a moment. So first, we're going to start out with the overview of the NSF Engines program. So a little bit about the National Science Foundation. I know a lot of you are familiar, but some in this room, this is your first time working with the NSF and learning about us. So we are a federal agency. We do about $8.5 billion a year. And the vast majority of that money, 94% of that goes directly out the door to fund research, education, and other activities. Within that $8.5 billion, about $200 million goes to public-private partnership and $1.4 billion to STEM education. We are organized around directorates. We have 7 directorates and 2 offices, and historically they've been organized around research areas. About a month and a half ago, we created a new directorate, the Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships Directorate, which sits across our existing directorates and has a real focus on commercialization, translation, economic growth, in creating the jobs of the future. The TIP Directorate is going to be something that we talk a little bit more about today, and it's where our NSF Engines program is housed. So the mission of TIP is to bring together the unbelievable talent we have in our country to advance critical and emerging technologies, address societal and economic challenges, and accelerate the translation of research results from lab to market. At a 30,000-foot level, we want to improve U.S. competitiveness, grow the U.S. economy, and train a diverse workforce for future high-wage jobs. So one of the signature initiatives within this new directorate is our program, the NSF Engines program. This is really, really exciting. We are going to be providing regions up to $160 million per awardee over a 10-year period to build their innovation ecosystem. So what does that mean? That means advancing critical technologies. That means driving economic growth, creating jobs, cultivating talent. This is a really cohesive, holistic approach to how we drive the emerging industries of our nation. So for those regions that are not just ready yet for an NSF engine and the $160 million, we also have what we call a Type 1 award, where you can apply for up to $1 million in 2 years to plan for an engine. Before we get into the weeds on the number of details, I just want to flag that June 30th, which is right around the corner, is the deadline to submit a concept outline. For a Type 1, that's 2 pages. For a Type 2, that is going to be 5 pages. So what is an NSF engine? It's a really good question. It is a multi-sector coalition of partners that are coming together to try to catalyze innovation ecosystems. They're led by a CEO, which is a new model for us, and they bring together stakeholders from industry, higher education, government, nonprofit, and even community-led organizations. So if you think about it, you have the NSF engine at the center, and then around that, you have the regional innovation ecosystem. If we're doing our job well, and we're working in close partnership, the NSF engine will catalyze the growth and expansion of the regional innovation ecosystem, creating new jobs, creating new startups, and driving growth for the region. So as we talked about, there's 2 types of awards. The Type 1, which is up to $1 million in 2 years, and that is for early stage ecosystems, both in terms of topic area and the broader ecosystem as a whole. And then you have the Type 2 award, which is the larger $160 million Engines award, and that spans the nascent, emergent, and growth stages. Is hopefully with the end of that period, you're at a mature state of an ecosystem and you are one of the world leaders in your topic area. So a lot of people ask us, what can be a topic area? What does it look like? This is far from an exhaustive list, but we wanted to give a couple of examples. So, your topic area could be climate change. It could be equitable access to healthcare and education. It could be infrastructure. And we recognize that there's subtopics within each of those topic areas. And also there are multiple technologies that are cross-cutting that could sit under any one of those topics. So for example, with climate change, it could be quantum, it could be AI, it could be hardware technologies, all could fit within that bucket of your topic area. And I just want to be really clear that these are just examples. We are topic area agnostic, as long as it is an industry that we think has emerging potential and is critical to national competitiveness. That can be your topic area for your NSF engine. A couple things I want to just highlight off the bat, because it will hopefully help frame up the conversations today. Our 3 main buckets for an engine are use-inspired research, translating things from innovation to practice, so taking things from lab to market, creating new companies around it, and driving economic growth at a regional level. And we have a real focus on comprehensive workforce development. A couple things that we should flag, which might be unique from other things that you've seen from NSF or even the federal government. We want you to create a culture of innovation. We want you to be nimble. We want you to be able to develop breakthrough technologies. We want you to think about financial sustainability from the start. We're going to be here for 10 years, which is a really long time, but we want you to be building for the next 10, 20, 30 years. And we want you to build in a way where the entire community is able to participate in the upside of this economic growth. So community wealth building is one of our central pillars. Our leadership model is slightly different. We want this to be CEO-led. There's governance structures, and there's a lot more detail on that we recommend you take a look at the BAA to find out more about. And then last but not least, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility is a central tenet. We didn't create a separate budget for DEIA or a separate bucket for it. We think it needs to be infused in everything that you do. And we're going to be looking for that across the entire engine and all of its activities. Eligible entities. In terms of being a lead, it could be an institution of higher education, a US-based nonprofit, or a for-profit organization. And this is new for us. This is a departure from things that you might have seen in the past. In terms of sub-awardees and people who can be core partners and receive funding, federal research labs, national laboratories, I know there's a couple of national laboratory representatives on the call today, and state and local governments, agencies, offices, divisions dedicated to innovation, economic, and workforce development. So if you are in state and local government, you can play a convening role, and you can also directly receive funds as a part of this program. There's several groups that are ineligible. I recommend that you go look at the BAA to learn more about those. So what does an NSF engine structure look like? We're going to lay out a couple of different models. This is far from exhaustive. I'd also recommend that you listen to our panelists today, and they'll talk about some of the models that they've built up in their own regions. But here's one potential model. You could have a consortium of colleges. It could be a vocational college, a research institution, a community college, and they could create a new entity to house all of those colleges, or it could be an entity that already exists within the region. And then there's a number of stakeholders who are around the table as well as core partners. It could be a VC that's passionate about your topic area, a philanthropic organization that cares deeply about regional economic growth, a workforce nonprofit, and others. And we recognize state and local government is critical because this needs to align with the economic growth of the region. And perhaps even a university that's from outside of the region might be involved because they have similar capacity or assets that align well with what you're doing in your region. Other models, you can create a new entity specifically for the purposes of an engine. A university can lead, or a corporation can lead. And we give examples of other organizations that could be around the table, far from exhaustive, but we want to get you thinking about potential models and who could be involved. So a question that I get a lot is, how does this fit into the broader ecosystem of activities that are happening at the state and the federal level? And the best way to describe it is the NSF engine starts at the roots and then runs up the stem of the plant. So we start at foundational and basic research, where NSF has a unique advantage and is uniquely qualified, but we want to create that connective research tissue across an entire ecosystem. So we're going to connect into the R&D focused economic development work and the direct investment activities that VCs, accelerators, and others are doing. We recognize this is a space where there's a number of stakeholders who are already doing incredible work, and we plan on working with them, catalyzing their work, and we're already having conversations with a number of federal agencies about ways to work together, including Department of Commerce, DOE, SBA, DOD, and others. And at the investment level, we're talking to incubators, accelerators, private investors, SSBCI, the Treasury program. So an integrated ecosystem is a critical component of this. What's next? Team formation starts today. We have our roadshows between now and June 15th. June 30th, concept outlines are going to be due. In August, we have Proposers Day, which will be open to anyone who submitted a concept outline and was accepted. And then along the way, if you want to put together events, you are welcome to organize events for your region. Here's some more details on upcoming events. If you come to today's roadshow, I wouldn't recommend coming to another. So we've had so much demand, we want to make sure everyone gets a chance. But we do have a Q&A session later this month that we would highly recommend that you check out, or come to our office hours as well if you have additional questions. So last thing, I want to kind of take this up to the 30,000 foot level. What we want to do is expand the geography of innovation. We want to create opportunity in more places for more people across our country. This is a bold, bold bet from the federal government, and we recognize no one can do this alone. It isn't going to happen alone in a city hall or in a university lab or even in a boardroom. It is going to take everyone working together, co-creating to achieve the ambitious goals of this program. So what we ask you before you go into these sessions now is, what would you do with $160 million? What would you build? How would you do it? How would you do it in a more inclusive way than things have been done in the past? These are the conversations that we hope you have today. We're really excited about it. And to kick things off, I'm going to turn things over to Dimitri and our ecosystem builder panel to talk a little bit about what this work has looked like on the ground in Massachusetts, North Carolina, New York, and other places around the country. So with that, I am going to introduce Dimitri and our fantastic panelists, and he can take it away from here. Thanks so much.
Sounds great. Thanks, Daniel. So welcome, everyone. We appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us today. And as Daniel mentioned, we have a very dynamic set of panelists here today to share with you, their insights from their experiences in establishing and working in innovation ecosystems in different areas of the U.S. So first we have, I'll just give a brief introduction, and then the panelists will have an opportunity to give an overview of their experiences and some opening words. So first we have Dr. Henry McKoy, who's a faculty member at North Carolina Central University, professor and founding director of Entrepreneurship Ecosystem Research Clinic and Lab. He's also the managing director for North Carolina Central University's Eagle Angel Network. We also have Orin Herskowitz, who is the Senior VP of Intellectual Property and Tech Transfer for Columbia University, as well as Executive Director of Columbia Technology Ventures. Orin also serves as an adjunct professor, teaching in intellectual property for entrepreneurship courses, and has served on boards or in leadership roles for a number of innovation and entrepreneurship focused initiatives, including Cyber NYC, Inventors to Founders programs, and NYC Media Lab. And then finally, we have Dr. Susan Bannister, who is a nationally and internationally recognized expert in biopharma innovation. Susan, from 2008 to 2015, was the founding CEO of the Massachusetts Life Sciences Center, which administers a $1.5 billion life sciences investment fund created by Massachusetts to catalyze innovation in all sectors of its life sciences community. And so I'll stop right there and allow the panelists to give their opening remarks and provide a little bit more details about your work. Why don't we begin with Henry?
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Great to, or maybe morning, I guess, depending on where you are. Great to see everybody. I'm Henry McKoy, as you said. I'm a professor at North Carolina Central University. And so the ecosystem that I live in is here in North Carolina, which is part of something called a Research Triangle Park, or, so Raleigh-Durham. You may hear about Raleigh-Durham. They are actually two different cities. Some people think they're one place, but they're two different cities. This Research Triangle Park ecosystem is something that's been around. It got kicked off in the mid-50s, and so we're talking now going on about 70 years. Interesting enough, a part of this conversation will be about inclusion and things of that nature. I'm at North Carolina Central University, which is a historically Black college, and so we were left out of that original launch of the ecosystem. You know about UNC Chapel Hill, Duke University, North Carolina State, who were part of that original group. But we have, over time, brought more historically Black colleges into this ecosystem. We have universities, and so the thing to keep in mind about the region that has grown to become really world-renowned now, and we're doing a lot of different things, is that the universities really have been anchors, and they have worked together in very strong ways to leverage research from those universities into the marketplace and commercialize those aspects. We couldn't do that without having some aspect of access to capital. And so, we are a banking state, but we also have developed in a lot of ways into a venture capital hub here in the southeastern part of the United States. And so that kind of capital has to be there at all levels. As mentioned, I run our angel network at the university, but we have venture capitalists and other folks in the area. And then kind of finally, this is not going to be anything, it's not an overnight thing. I mean, this takes time to develop that infrastructure, to develop that pipeline that creates this ecosystem. And so my work is in trying to make sure it's inclusive, diverse, and that it also ties into this bigger aspect of commercial marketplaces. So looking forward to this panel.
Thanks, Henry. Orin, why don't you go next?
Great. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Hi, Orin Herskowitz. I'm from Columbia University. I joined Columbia 16 years ago after 7 years in the Boston Consulting Group. So I'm neither a lawyer nor a scientist, but I think when I started off this role, I was running the tech transfer office at the university. And I think some of you probably are either from the tech transfer office or work closely with them, but very much focused on patenting in university innovations and then licensing them out. And I think what's happened at Columbia, but certainly across the country over the last 10 years or so with an accelerating pace over the last 4 or 5, is really the role of a university has changed, I think, in our innovation ecosystems. And the role of the people in the university who did stuff related to this, like the tech transfer offices, has changed tremendously. So in addition to working with the scientists coming up with scientific innovations funded often by the NSF or the NIH, many of my peers across the country and also faculty and other administrators at the universities have started to take on roles relating to industry relations and getting access in both directions to these cutting edge data sets without which the science doesn't really work, or materials, finding jobs for students and consulting opportunities for faculty. And probably most importantly, providing all the things that a great idea needs to make it out of the lab and into the market to help society. So things like entrepreneurship training, customer discovery, mentoring and advising, validation stage, small amounts of money to help the startups prototype and see if their science works, helping them start the companies with things like legal support and connections to business mentors, and then ultimately connections to VCs and angel investors, real estate where they can start and grow, these incubators and accelerators, step out space and beyond. So really the role of the university has changed. And I think if many of you were coming from universities, this is an opportunity, I think, to seize onto to something to help not only change the way the university itself works, but also work with a much broader ecosystem. So I know New York has really been a great success story over the last sort of 15, 20 years in particular. I remember when Mayor Bloomberg first started to try and make New York a true startup hub. But it's not just the universities, it's the city government, it's the state government, it's venture capital groups, it's angel networks in town, it's workforce development organizations and not-for-profits. It's public-private partnerships that are focused on trying to achieve these same goals. It's the real estate developers and the local attorneys and business leaders. So it really is a multi-stakeholder proposition. And part of it is about getting stuff done, and part of it is also about telling the story about getting stuff done and bragging about it and making it seem like your region is an area that is poised to grow. So it's really, and I'll echo what Henry said, it takes a long time. It is a very slow game, but it can pay off in the long run. So looking forward to the panel as we go.
Thanks, Orin. And Sue, finally, you're up to bat.
Dimitri, thanks, and really thanks for the invitation to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about a state level initiative which began in Massachusetts in 2007, when the governor, state officials, and life sciences leaders from academia and industry agreed on a vision to have Massachusetts be a place where life sciences innovation could thrive, and where more of the research that was going on in our universities would get translated, developed, and commercialized. So very much, I think, in terms of what you were saying, Orin, what's going on in the university and getting out into the market. The leaders agreed, though, that in order for this to be successful, the private sector couldn't do it at scale. It had to be a public-private partnership, and all regions of the state needed to benefit. So in 2008, the state enacted an initiative, the Life Sciences Initiative, to achieve this vision. It's a 15-year initiative. It was funded at $100 million a year, and so it's up for recapitalization in 2023. The initiative is administered by an organization, the Mass Life Sciences Center, which was funded and created by that legislation. The center is a nonprofit. It's funded by a 7-member board of directors. It's advised by an advisory board, and it makes its funding decisions based on a competitive process. So where are these investments being targeted? The first is grants that have been used to promote an academic culture that is more inclusive of translational research and urges academic institutions to form companies that can spin out. The second is to provide risk capital to fund startup companies and to attract more outside investment to Massachusetts. The third is workforce development, which includes grants to our grade schools to help them better teach STEM, especially in economically challenged and underserved communities. An internship program that's provided pathways into the industry and has funded thousands of internships since 2008. The fourth is infrastructure, support for incubators, accelerators, co-working spaces, and finally, and most importantly, as Henry said, it's really to coalesce what has been a cluster of academic institutions, investors, companies into an ecosystem. And I like to say a cluster is a geographic concentration of organizations, assets, resources, and people. In an ecosystem, these assets work together to get high leverage and to accelerate the pace of innovation. Thanks. Looking forward to our breakout sessions.
Great. Thanks. So I'll just start the panel with a few questions, and Sue, maybe I'll start with you if you don't mind. So your focus is more at the state level, and you mentioned that the focus of your efforts have been on life sciences. And within this Engines program, one of the challenges is for each region is to identify, what area of focus, R&D focus should the engine really consider. And so could you talk a little bit about how Massachusetts chose life sciences as its focus area?
Sure. There was a lot of work that was going on in our academic institutions around the life sciences, which we defined to be pharma, biotech, devices, diagnostics, and bioinformatics. And that sounds broad, but it's really where these areas are coming together that we're getting a lot of innovation. But what we worked really hard to do was to help each region of the state identify where in life sciences they had strengths and could potentially have greater strength. So for example, the southern part of our state, the western part of our state, really strong in manufacturing. The eastern part of the state, much stronger in terms of research. So we really did spend a lot of time once we had defined where we wanted to focus to get even more precisely focused and to really work with each part of the state to figure out where they could really thrive in that area.
Sure, very good. Thank you. And so Orin, maybe let me follow up with you here along the same lines. You mentioned the necessity of involving universities and so forth. And so, and typically it's not just a single university within a region. So can you talk a bit about Columbia's lab to market model, which includes startups and pre-startups from other universities, not just Columbia, and how you guys went about making the decision to involve other universities and how the IP works, that it may not be solely affiliated with Columbia. Just talk a little bit about how that model actually works.
Sure. There's a lot of questions in there, so I may not get to them all. And if you want me to follow up, I'm happy to.
Sure.
So I totally agree with what Sue was saying. It really is, every region has its own strengths and its own challenges. And sometimes even those are sort of geography based. So, in New York, in New York, there were a lot of strengths that New York City had. It's the financial capital of the world. It has an incredibly strong group of local universities. A huge, I think it's number 2 recipient of NIH funding, very high up there in NSF funding. It also has a lot of challenges. So, real estate is incredibly scarce and incredibly expensive. There's not a lot of real estate that's zoned for biotech, or there wasn't at the time. And the universities here, I think, my early days in town, the universities here had a real culture of working together, partially because there actually wasn't a huge culture of biotech commercialization in town. And so we were all sort of forced to work together to try and make that change. And so I think, in New York, one of the things that's a real strength of New York now is that the universities had an existing set of relationships and worked very closely together to do things like put on joint pitch days for our startups. To when a venture capitalist came to town and met any of us, we would introduce them to all of us. So we share our relationships. Many of our faculty work really closely together. And so we have interinstitutional agreements that are already set up to make that easy to do. Columbia has something like 35 core facilities. CUNY, the City University of New York, right down the block, has a very similar number of core facilities. So we share them. So all of our startups can, our startups and our faculty can work collaboratively together. So that's a real asset. And I think a lot of cities and a lot of regions don't necessarily have those kind of close relationships. And so this is a good opportunity to start forging those, I think. One of the things that I think, Dimitri, you were referring to is we started a program called the Lab to Market Accelerator Network, which started off with a grant from the Coulter Foundation to run a biomedical device accelerator on campus. And that was very Columbia focused at the time. And after we ran that one, we realized the model worked really well. And so we launched another one around clean energy. But interestingly, so for clean energy at the time, there wasn't, there's a lot going on at Columbia, but it wasn't everything going on at Columbia. And so we joined together with NYU and CUNY, Stony Brook University, and Brookhaven National Labs to co-propose, and Cornell, to co-propose to launch a clean energy accelerator across all the programs. And we worked out all the details around how IP would be managed, and how commercialization would be managed, and how the funding would be split, and how the governance would work. And once we'd done that once, we realized that worked really well. So now we've got programs, I think, which Daniel alluded to. We ran one for the New York City Mayor's Office called the Cyber Lab NYC, which is across the whole region. We run another for the State Clean Energy Funding Agency, which is across all of New York State around climate. We run them in cancer and rare diseases and computational drug discovery. And it turns out that working together actually works really well. It's not surprising, but it turns out more brains on a problem is good as long as you can manage the infrastructure. And so I'm happy to talk about that to anyone who's interested in how we run our programs. Did I get the questions you asked, Dimitri?
Yes, very good. Thanks, Orin. And so Henry, let me go to you. So I know that you spent significant time in the State Economic Development Agency as well as obviously in the academic setting. And so can you talk a little bit about, and so within the Engines program, obviously that's going to be very important for any engine to be successful, to combine the resources at the state and the local government level along with industry. Can you talk a little bit about the interplay between the economic development side and the goals of the academic institutions? Sometimes they don't necessarily, the institution doesn't see itself as being in that space. Can you talk a little bit about the interplay and the need for the universities to kind of build the infrastructure to support this kind of activity?
Yeah, well, I think that's a great question when you're talking about building out any ecosystem. And actually, part of my response will tie into something that Sue said as well as Orin. Interesting enough, my beginning of my career actually started in the private sector. I was a banker. I was a banker for the first decade in North Carolina's a banking state, as I mentioned. And I was there during the kind of Wild West days as banks were merging and going interstate and international, things of that nature. And so that ends up being important to this dialogue, because again, I talked about from a regional standpoint, the Research Triangle Park, which has become this tech hub, and we are behind California and Boston, in terms of life sciences, I think number 3. And so really the creation of this ecosystem actually kicked off from the private side. Or RTP, there was a developer named Romeo Guest who had this vision for what could be this this kind of research hub, and I think he had some self-interest in it, but he certainly felt like that there was something around the 1950s that was happening in some of what was then advanced manufacturing around that. Went to the governor, so went to the state and tried to convince the governor at the time of this potential opportunity for this hub that could be a economic driver. Brought in some bankers, and essentially the early part of the core aspect of thinking about the Research Triangle Park was this idea that North Carolina had always been a heavy investor in the university system across the state. And so what you had was, as an agrarian state, you had individuals coming off farms going into the university, being educated come out of university 4 years later, it's like, well, where do you want me to work? I'm not going back to the farm. And so North Carolina, in a lot of ways, was subsidized in places like New York and Chicago and things like that. So part of the vision was to create this hub that would recapture that talent from the state. And so the universities became a key part of that aspect. And so initially, the state had to convince the universities, UNC, Duke, and North Carolina State, to actually collaborate, because there was all this kind of siloedness, and the silos inside universities. There were certainly silos across the universities, and so you had to convince them that it was in their best interest to come together, because there was value in that. And again, this is in the 1950s and 60s, and so there wasn't that notion of understanding that we have now. IBM was an early corporate partner. So IBM was the first corporation to anchor here. And part of that ended up being because they were looking for a new site for their headquarters, or one of their headquarters. And North Carolina had really good weather, right? And so it's like, well, where would people want to move to from that standpoint? So all these factors come into play when you start talking about creating these ecosystems. And to a point that Sue made earlier, we then, as a state, started creating these centers. Like, so we created something called the North Carolina Biotech Center, right? Long before we ever became a biotech hub, we created, these different kind of centers that we're going to say, hey, as a state, we're going to pursue these things. And so what I take from that, or what I want to offer from that, is that it really does take some forethought and some vision to lay these pieces together. And again, a part of that idea of recapturing talent that came off farms and keeping it in the state to create that economic development has now turned into a place where people from other places want to come and bring their talent as well. And so it becomes a matter of, workforce and industry, everybody working together for some kind of greater good of the environment that you're creating, that employees want to be here, that it's creating jobs, that it drives state revenue, and this kind of quality of the work that's getting done. And it certainly helps the universities, because it helps them attract faculty and students.
Great. Thank you. Sue, yes, you have a follow-up statement.
I want to add a quick comment that I think ties together a point that all three of us are making, and I think is so important. Innovation is driven by the talent of your workforce. And so, Henry, you've talked about one aspect of this. Orin has, but I really hope that all of these initiatives will think about ways to make sure that we are being inclusive of our workforce, because women, people of color, are still underrepresented in the innovation sectors and represent huge untapped talent that we are going to need if we are really going to be competitive and successfully build these various innovation hubs. So I just wanted to add that.
And I do, let me jump in real quick, because I do think that was, obviously when RTP was launched in the 1950s, it was a very different place in terms of that. But I do think that we still have ramifications of that exclusion to this day, right? Again, North Carolina has more HBCUs and minority serving institutions than anybody else. We have 10. And including in the research training part, we have North Carolina Central, St. Augustine, Shaw, right around here. So it's not like we weren't here at the time. NCCU's been around since 1910. And so even to this day, there is still challenges to creating that bridge of inclusion that, if it would have been there at the start, would have been a part of developing the ecosystem that we now see. So it's easier to start at the beginning than to try to bring in inclusion later down the path.
Great, Henry. So let's follow up along those lines just a little bit more then. So within the Engines program, as Daniel mentioned in the presentation, there's a great focus on inclusion and diversity and within the Engine at the very beginning, at being co-creators of the Engine itself, and then growing out the innovation ecosystem. And so you mentioned the number of HBCUs in North Carolina. Can you talk a little bit about, how an Engine might go about ensuring that inclusion and diversity, that there is no separate thing to discuss? It's just a part of the Engine from the very beginning, embedded throughout the leadership. Can you talk a little bit more about how an Engine might go about doing that? How universities could have meaningful partnerships, how industry and HBCUs can have meaningful partnerships, where there's co-creation across the board.
Oh yeah, well, I think that is absolutely crucial, and certainly, with this engine program, I mean, it's what kind of gives you hope that hopefully this kind of ecosystem building and creation can have that from the very get-go. What I would encourage any organization that's thinking about this is to, again, integrate it from the very start, bringing people to the table. What happens sometimes is that, you have folks that get in the corner and they come up with this plan and this vision, and then they start moving along, they start developing the vision and all this stuff. And then at the end, they kind of invite some people to kind of cover aspects of, gender diversity or racial diversity or whatever the case. Those things should be there from the get-go, and also create an environment that is essentially is incredibly welcoming to those voices. I always use an example that, is thinking about, if you're going to invite me to a meal and you say, hey, well, I want you to come to this meal and I want to make sure that you feel comfortable at the meal. So I'm gonna help you, you can help us, work on the menu. Well, if we all, for whatever reason, decide we want chicken salad, right? You say, oh, well, you said you want chicken salad, and then you go off someplace and you make the chicken salad, then come back and then you invite me to dinner. I say, wait a minute, I thought I didn't tell you I wanted chicken salad with raisins and grapes in it, right? I mean, that may just not be my style. I mean, maybe we should have kind of talked about because I see that a lot, right? It's like, oh, well, we got your opinion way back when and we included it, and now we bring you back at the end with what we developed, as opposed to sitting down from the get-go and deciding and co-creating this, right? And bringing different perspectives to the table. And just because you don't have 10 HBCUs in your state doesn't mean that there aren't people and organizations and very talented people who can come to the table. And I say the last thing about that is really create an environment of openness, right? Meaning that people can speak their mind, without kind of some fear that you're going to get all this retribution and say, oh, we're never going to work. I mean, people need to speak their truth, and everywhere I go, and I mean, there's always a history, a story, particularly as it relates to race, that you have to take into account as you think about these aspects. So just create an open environment that allows for this from the very get-go, and keep people at the table throughout the process to co-create whatever this looks like.
Great. So we could continue this, have a lot of follow-up questions, but we need to stop right now. And so I'll turn it over to Daniel, and he'll give everyone instructions, and the panelists will still be involved in the breakout rooms. So I'll turn it over to you, Daniel, and you can give us some instruction on what happens next. Thanks to the panelists for your very candid thoughts there. I appreciate it.
Great. All right. So thank you so much, everyone. That was a fantastic discussion. And the panelists are going to be joining us in the breakout room. So you're going to have an opportunity to continue the dialogue with them during this next section. So what's next? We have our breakout rooms. The goal of these breakout rooms is for you to meet other people in your region who are thinking about applying. We hope this will be a jump off point for conversation. So, we want you to talk about the strengths of your regions as areas for growth. And we want this to be a very inclusive conversation. You'll notice that there's going to be people from multiple sectors in the room. All of them are going to be meaningfully engaged in building an engine. So we want these to be very inclusive conversations and talk about the value that each type of institution can bring to an application. Very importantly, this is not a pitch session to NSF on your idea. This is not a competitive environment. And this should not be the first and last time that you should meet with others in your region. So we've been doing these for a number of different regions across the country. And sometimes people just kind of stay quiet in their room thinking they're going to be able to glean information and use that to their advantage. That is not the goal of this. That is not going to set you up for success. And after June 30th, we're going to publish every concept outline. So keeping your lips tight right now doesn't benefit you, because all that data is going to be out in the open after June 30th before applications are due in the fall. So in just a moment, breakout rooms are going to open up. You can go to whatever room you want to start in. We recommend you start in your home state, but you're also welcome to move to other states. We broke California into Southern and Northern California. If you want to move across the state, that's fantastic. If you're in a different state and you want to move, that works as well. A question that we get a lot is, how do you determine region of service? We don't tell you that it needs to be this many people or this many cities. Basically, the way I would think about it is it needs to be right sized to absorb up to $160 million, including leverage. So, this can be a larger metro area. It can be multiple metros. It can include rural areas. It can even include parts of different states and adjacent states. And an important thing to mention is we are open to all regions across the country, but we do prioritize regions that do not have a well-established innovation ecosystem or have not fully participated in the tech boom of the past decades. An important note that I mention every single time, regions are going to be strengthened by working collaboratively rather than a region submitting multiple proposals in a similar topic area. Collaboration, working together will benefit you throughout this process. When you get into the breakout rooms, you're going to hear a little bit more about the framing questions. I'm not going to go into too much detail about them now, but they're going to center on regional analysis, partnerships, and next steps coming out of this. Last but not least, these are the deadlines. Write them down if you don't already have them. Concept outlines, which is the first hurdle in this process, they are due on June 30th. That is both for type 1s and type 2s. So after that point, everyone is going to know what topic areas people are thinking about. We highly recommend you start the regional planning and coalition building before June 30th, but there will be opportunities after June 30th and between September to coalesce as a region and come together and do mergers and everything like that. Type 1 deadline is September 29th. And then in FY23, we'll have a type 2 deadline, which we hope to announce in the near future. So with that, I am going to pause and we are going to open up the breakout rooms. Everybody is going to be able to move freely. You do not need us to move you, but if you have issues entering a breakout room, stay in this main room and we'll help you out, but highly recommend that you move yourself to your breakout room now. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and excited for you all to continue the conversation in the breakout rooms.